Take one. How's my hair?
Looks good to me.
That's all I really care about. I'm in it for the aesthetic.
You're in it for the hair?
Yeah.
The aesthetics.
That's why I like sitting down with you, Cameron.
Yeah.
Because
you know that I am.
It's a travesty that you're currently covering it up with that hat, because it's
I didn't want to
one of your best traits.
I didn't want the contrast to be too noticeable.
Yeah, it would kind of put me off a little bit if I had to compete with that. So thanks. I appreciate it.
Well, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I am here in person with Alex O'Connor from the Cosmic Skeptic YouTube channel. And what we're covering today are different atheist slogans. In fact, we're covering 10 different atheist slogans. I'm going to get Alex's response to these slogans, and then we'll have some good back and forth. And it's going to be a really, 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 really chill and fun episode. So I can't wait to get into it. Shall we start?
Why not? I hope so. You gave me an idea of some of these slogans earlier today.
But most of them you have not heard yet.
Most of them I've not heard. So this is going to be off the cuff.
Off the cuff.
Casual skeptic.
Casual. Very. Yes. So the first one is, there is no evidence. That's it.
There is no evidence.
There is no evidence.
Or there is no evidence for God.
There is no evidence.
Because there is no evidence is a bit of a strong claim, although I do know some people who might take that, some sort of Cartesian skeptics and some emotivists indeed. In the context of the God discussion, I think it is a ridiculous claim to suggest that there is no evidence for God, but I can understand, I think, why some people would make this claim. And it has a lot to do with the fact that people fail to consider a cumulative case for the existence of God. What I mean by that is there are two forms of successful argument. I spoke a little bit about this in the event that I did with Trent Horn recently. That there are two ways in which an argument can be successful, and I forget what they're called. There is a name for them, but in essence, an argument could be successful in the sense that it makes the conclusion more probably true than false. That's one way an argument can be successful. But another way an argument can be successful is if it makes a conclusion more probably true than it was sans the argument. So a lot of people have this idea in their head that if you hear an argument for God or evidence for God, and it's hard to kind of draw a distinction there exactly, but certain teleological arguments for God's existence, like the fine-tuning argument, you might say that the constant of the strength of the strong nuclear force is evidence for God. Now, does this make God's existence more likely true than false? Does it make God more likely to exist than not exist? No. But does it make him more likely to exist than without that consideration? I think yes, at least marginally. Now, this might only increase your credence from, say, 2% to 3%. But I think that a lot of people are expecting that successful evidence must push us over the 50% boundary. It must be that this piece of evidence is only a functional piece of evidence if it manages to essentially establish God's existence or make it more likely true than not. But I think you can also get successful evidence that just slightly increases your credence, because of course if you get enough of those kinds of evidences, then even if it's only marginally pushing up your credence, it may eventually push it over 50%. But even so, this is talking about the metrics for good evidence. These are two ways that evidence can be successful. But of course you can have unsuccessful evidence or bad evidence or evidence that kind of doesn't really do anything for you. You could still consider it evidence, it's just kind of bad evidence. And so to say there's absolutely no evidence in favor of God, I think is a mistake. But I kind of understand the mindset of somebody who says that. I think what they mean to say is that they've never heard any consideration that has made them go, yeah, that establishes God's existence, in the way that they might look at a scientific explanation for something. Like you look at natural selection, you look at the evidence for natural selection, and you say, well, if we look at the fossil record, this evidence seems to establish the truth of natural selection. So there is evidence for natural selection. But of course, there's some forms of evidence for natural selection that only slightly increase our credence in it, like the vestigial traits, for example, the fact that we have a tailbone. I don't think the fact that we have a tailbone alone is enough to establish natural selection as the origin of our species, but it does marginally increase our credence. And so if we're considering that kind of evidence to be successful too, there are lots of wonderful evidences for God's existence. I just don't think they're powerful enough to push me into the plus 50% boundary.
Yeah. So there's a philosopher friend of mine, his name is Josh Rasmussen. He's got a really good distinction that he makes between having some evidence on the one hand and then having sufficient evidence on the other. So the evidence might not be sufficient on its own, like you were saying, to get you over that 50% mark or whatever percent mark you want to put it at. But you could nevertheless have some evidence that might increase your credence a little bit. Like you said, that the numbers you gave were like from 2 to 3%. And I think that that's right. You can still have some evidence, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got sufficient evidence for the existence of God. Now, obviously, as a Christian theist, I think that the evidence is sufficient. Well, I guess that doesn't actually necessarily follow from me being a Christian theist, but I do think that the evidence, there is some evidence when taken together would get you over that mark.
Of course, not all Christians are evidentialists.
Right, exactly.
You know, this is something that Christopher Hitchens brought up in his debate with William Lane Craig, criticizing his claim of being an evidentialist by saying that Craig himself had said that, well, there's this quote that keeps coming up by Craig. What is it he says? There's a difference between how you know something and how you show something, right? He said this before. And Hitchens kind of pressed him on this point and said, look, you call yourself an evidentialist, but we have it in writing that the reason you're a Christian is because of the witness of the Holy Spirit. And even if the evidence pointed away from that, you would still favor Christianity because of the witness of the Holy Spirit. Dostoevsky said the same thing, interestingly. He wrote a letter to a friend in which he said that even if all of the evidence and all of the truth pointed away from Christ, I'd still reject the truth and put myself in with Christ, or reject the facts and put myself in with Christ, as if to say, I don't really care what the evidence says. I'm a Christian because of the witness of the Holy Spirit. Now, I don't think there's a problem with this intrinsically. If somebody wishes to live their life thinking that their metric for truth is what they feel is being spoken to in their soul, then they can go right ahead. The only reason why this kind of view gets mocked or not taken seriously is because in the context of a discussion, that is the only time you're going to see somebody arguing, well, this is why I'm a Christian and you should be too, that would be a weird thing to say. The religious experience and the witness of the Holy Spirit, whatever that means, is certainly a good reason for an individual to become a Christian. I can understand why they would do so, but it's never going to be enough to convince somebody else. So in the context of a debate or an apologetic or something like this, it would be mocked if somebody tried to put that forward as evidence. But for them, it's worth bearing in mind that they're not a Christian because of the evidence at all.
For Dr. Craig, I think he mentions that he's got like two sources of warrant. So one of the sources is the Holy Spirit, and then the other are the arguments.
Craig is certainly not as strong as Dostoevsky on that point, but he at least recognizes that there's an element and a strong element of his faith that is not based on the evidence, but rather based on the witness of the Holy Spirit.
Although, see, then we get into questions of like, what do we actually mean by evidence?
Quite right, because it can be personal evidence. This is why when I debate Jonathan McGlatchy, which I've done twice now, he has a strong emphasis, being an evidentialist, on the public evidence. It's not just that there's good evidence for God, but there's good public evidence. There's evidence that everybody can
see, but I don't even like that distinction.
Reach. You don't?
No, because the public evidence still has to be interpreted through your own personal, your own senses and experience.
As you say, it depends on what we count as the evidence, right? Because if the evidence is
how we define the term.
If the evidence is the finely tuned constant, then observation of a finely tuned constant in the universe is publicly available. Anybody can do the observations, do the maths, and work out what the constant is. That's clearly of a different category to something like a personal religious experience. Seeing a blinding light and hearing Cameron, why are you persecuting me? You know, that's clearly a different kind of experience. And I think that each are going to be equally valid in a person coming to belief in God. Each is going to be, in fact, the latter is going to be more powerful, but it's going to be less useful in an apologetic scenario. And that's why you have to bear in mind when you're watching people debate that, especially for like a Christian who is debating this kind of stuff, but maybe isn't only a Christian because of the evidence, but does think there is good evidence, you have to keep in mind that there's a whole element of their faith which is not really subject to that mode of discussion.
So how about we move on to the second slogan? We spent about, I don't actually know when we started, but we spent a good amount of time on that one. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so the next one is the Kalam doesn't get you all the way to God. Do you like that? First of all, do you even like that, like the idea behind it? And I want to be charitable to these as well. So like, do you find that objection, like, is it useful? Is it helpful at all? Even if you don't think that it ultimately succeeds?
It's certainly helpful in that we need to make it clear what particular arguments actually seek to establish. I made a Kalam video years and years ago where I made this claim. I said, look, sure, the universe has a cause, but that cause doesn't need to be God. I made a video a few years later debunking myself, and one of the points that I made was that, like, if the argument doesn't claim to do that, then it's not a problem. This is going to depend on the formulation of the Kalam, right? If the only conclusion is the universe has a cause, that is the conclusion of the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, some people think, I think quite plausibly, that you can draw out of this cause certain qualities, because you can say, well, if this cause created the universe, then since time is a quality of the universe and matter is a quality of the universe, it must be timeless and it must be spaceless. And to get an infinite cause but a finite effect, that it seems like this cause must have to do something. So you can start kind of ascribing qualities to this cause which look a lot like God. And I think that's quite a powerful argument. But even if you're unconvinced by that, it's worth bearing in mind that the only conclusion of the Kalam is the universe has a cause. So if somebody says, yeah, but that cause doesn't need to be God, okay, doesn't mean the argument's unsuccessful. So the claim is correct in that the Kalam doesn't get you to God, but it doesn't claim to do that. So I don't see what the problem is.
Yeah, so my thought on that is, and I made a video on this, is basically that there's different versions of the Kalam. There's a few points to make. So first of all, there's different versions of the Kalam, and there is one version in particular that's been put forward in the academic literature by a guy named Jacobus Erasmus, and he's got a version of the Kalam that does explicitly mention God in the premises, in his syllogism. So that's one thing to bear in mind, is that this is really only an objection to like one specific formulation. And typically it's like the formulation put forward by Dr. Craig, like the most well-known version of the argument.
Of course, William Lane Craig is the man who gave the argument its name, and that's his formulation. So when somebody says the Kalam, that's what I think of. People like to talk about new versions of the Kalam. I don't know what it is that makes them.
Well, see, but the argument existed before Dr. Craig.
Of course.
So he just put a label on the argument that like already existed.
Yeah, but
so that's the way that I look at it. Is like the argument. There's different formulations of it. He's the one who like put a label on that type of argument. But the argument existed way before Dr. Craig, way before even Al-Ghazali. So. But some versions do explicitly mention God. So like it just doesn't, the objection to me doesn't even get off the ground. Now that being said, I have another point that I wanted to make, which is that the Kalam usually comes in two different stages. It's usually presented in two different stages. So the way that Dr. Craig presents it, like you kind of already mentioned this, is like he's got this stage one case where he basically goes through his syllogism and he's like, okay, the universe has a cause. And then the stage two case is basically looking at an analysis, a conceptual analysis of what that cause has to be like. And there's different stage two arguments that one can make. But if this objection is basically just saying that the Kalam doesn't get you to God, really all that it's saying is that the stage one case is not the stage two case, because the stage two case is often given, and it's pretty much given in every single context that it's presented. So the stage one case is not the stage two case, but that's not really a good objection either. There's no sense in which this objection is like remotely good.
Well, there could be a sense. Of course, you've got to consider the context in which the argument's being put forward. If somebody's an agnostic who's never thought about the philosophy of religion ever, and they hear Craig's formulation of the Kalam, and then they go, right, God must exist. Christianity must be true. And they run to their friends and they say, look, I'm a Christian because everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, so the universe has a cause. I think it'd be quite right for the friends to say,
slow down.
But hold on, you haven't got a God. That doesn't get you to God. It certainly doesn't get you to Christianity. So it's going to depend on the context in which it's being put forward. Generally, if you're speaking to a philosopher or an apologist in the context of a debate, they're aware of this kind of stuff. And so you can kind of assume that they would know better. You can kind of say, well, that's not a great argument, and the fact that you've just used it to establish God's existence is a bit weird. But in the context of somebody excitedly using it to express to their friends their belief in God, I think it would make sense, don't you think, to say, well, the Kalam doesn't get you to God.
Yeah, if that person was trying to present it and they only gave the stage 1 case and they didn't know about the stage 2 case, or they were just kind of like ignorant about the argument, they just learned about it, then yeah, it's a good point to make.
It's just the way you kind of said quite confidently, there's just no way in which this objection makes sense to me. It's like, maybe that's just because we're so drenched in this kind of conversation, we do it all the time, that we forget that one of the reasons why apologetics exists in the first place is to make arguments for God's existence accessible to everybody. That's why, like, if you get a bit too philosophical, it's not really seen as apologetics anymore. It's just seen as doing philosophy. Apologetics specifically seems to be, let's make God's existence accessible through public evidence, to the extent that you should expect that a lot of people will be... This might be the very first argument they ever come across for God's existence. It wouldn't surprise me. It seems to be where a lot of people start. And if they were to establish the existence of God and a particular God of a particular religion on the basis of it alone, then it would be the case that actually they've made a mistake there.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Alex. I'll give you that. Okay, so let's move on to number 3. And this one is... something that I've had a philosopher on my channel to talk about, and it's actually one of my favorite videos that I've done. So the objection or the slogan or whatever you want to call it is, if you had been born elsewhere, then you probably wouldn't be a Christian. So that's the basic rundown of it. What are your thoughts on that, like that type of slogan?
Well, I think for a start, it's of course true. Geography is a reliable statistical indicator of religious belief. But there are a lot of things to say on this. Firstly, we have to be careful.
Real quick, on the point of geography, if you actually look at a map of the demographics of Christianity, Christianity is like the only religion. The last time that I looked, Christianity is the only religion that is sort of geographically not centrally located. So it's like everywhere.
Yes.
So
yet still, the problem is that Christianity is a very individualistic, personal religion. It's about an individual's relationship with God. It may be the case that there are lots of hubs of Christianity all over the world, and there's no place you can point to that's like the Mecca of Christianity. However, it is still true that if you're born in Medina, or if you're born in Mecca, or if you're born in Indonesia, you're far less likely to become a Christian, to be a Christian, than were you born in Texas, for example. And this does seem to require some explanation. Now, of course, you'll be told that it commits the genetic fallacy to say that, oh, the reason that you're Christian is because you were born a Christian. That doesn't make Christianity false. Of course it doesn't. But there are different ways this objection can be formulated. If I say something like, well, Christianity seems not to be true because the only reason that you're a Christian is because you were born in Texas, then that would, of course, be fallacious. It doesn't make Christianity false that you came to it through the wrong means.
Like you said, the genetic fallacy.
That is the genetic fallacy. But there are versions of this objection, bearing in mind that a lot of the time when an objection is put forward, somebody isn't being super careful with their words. They're trying to drive at an idea, and I think we have to avoid being pedantic and saying, well, technically that commits this fallacy, because what is it they're getting at? And I think with this observation, what they're getting at is the fact that it does seem troubling, and I talked about this in my debate with Jonathan McLatchy, the second one. Does it not seem troubling to you? I'll ask you what I asked him.
Sure.
That, at least on a Christian worldview, your place of birth seems to be a reliable statistical indicator of how likely you are to be saved. That seems to be troubling. Now, this isn't the kind of thought or problem that commits the genetic fallacy. You must think that that's at least a little bit troubling. It's something you at least have to kind of work on and think about. You can't dismiss it as a logically fallacious argument or something. Why is it that this is the case? This, to me, falls under the umbrella of divine hiddenness. Why does God hide his face more from somebody living in Rwanda than to somebody living in Thailand, which is something like 95% Buddhist and therefore, at best, 5% theistic? Could it be that, the Thai are just naturally 20 times more predisposed to being stubborn, or to not engaging with argument, or to, not seeing the revelation that's been made so obvious around them, so that they are without excuse, as Paul says in Romans? That doesn't seem right to me. We do seem to need an explanation of how there could be a God who wants to come to know every individual on the planet, and yet allows a situation to obtain in which we have a statistically reliable indicator of how likely someone is to be saved purely based on where they're born. Surely that's a problem.
Well, I like how you turn this into like from what it was into like an argument from divine hiddenness. I think that's actually like it can be helpful because that's one interpretation of how this objection can be put.
Yes, but you can imagine if somebody's raising that objection, they might say something like, because look, if you were born in Medina, you'd probably be a Muslim. That, of course, isn't an argument on its own, but clearly when people say things like this, they're euphemizing or they're using a shorthand for a line of thought which can be syllogized if we're careful, but most conversations aren't done in syllogistic form, as we well know. It's quite strange the way that whenever you watch the conversations online and these kinds of things, that we're always very careful to define our terms. This isn't how human beings usually interact. Of course, our job as apologetics or trying to kind of make philosophy accessible, our job is to take these thoughts that people have and try to make them specific and syllogize them.
Yeah.
And so although the statement itself is not an argument on its own, and certainly not a very good one if it were, I think it is a shorthand for something which is a very important argument.
Yeah. Yeah, so my basic thoughts, and I kind of align with Joe Schmidt on this, is that, well, first of all, there's kind of built into this idea that salvation is something that's like sort of exclusive to only those that have like heard the gospel. And so I'm what you might call an inclusivist. I think that it's possible to be saved apart from having conscious knowledge of Christ, and there's different reasons for that. And then there's also the fact that I'm like a hopeful universalist, so I feel like, or at least I'm hopeful of the idea that everyone will eventually be saved. So that's
one way around it. It seems a little bit ad hoc to me for somebody to say, especially if you say that the reason why you're an inclusivist is because of this problem of geographical predictability.
So that's not the reason why.
But I'd imagine it's not.
Yeah.
But if somebody did that as a response, it would seem like a bit of a disposal problem.
Well, I'm just pointing out one like sort of assumption behind the argument.
Yes.
Is that like, does this determine whether or not you're saved? I don't think that's what's going to determine.
I'm inclined to take the same view. I think if I were a Christian, I'd be at least an inclusivist. I don't think I'd be a universalist, because I think it's clear that Christ implies that those who do.
Have you seen some of the philosophical arguments in favor of universalism?
I've seen a few.
There's atheists who have them and they're decent.
Yes.
Like the philosophical, I'm not saying the scriptural arguments, but the philosophical arguments can actually be kind of powerful.
The philosophical arguments are going to be incredibly steadfast, especially because it does seem unethical to send people to hell as long as there's such thing as a non-resistant non-believer, as Schellenberg famously formulated it. It seems troubling to send them to hell through no fault of their own. But it does seem to me that scripturally we have good reason to think that those who make it to heaven are those who do the will of the Father. This isn't the same thing as being a nominal Christian. Being of course, like at the time of Jesus, there was no such thing as Christianity. There was what we would kind of now call Christianity, but Christianity was just kind of following Christ. And to follow Christ is essentially to do the will of the Father. Now, there's an interesting consideration here, which is that, sure, you're more likely to be a Christian if you're born in Texas than if you're born in Malaysia. But are you more likely to do the will of the Father? Sure, there might be a lot of nominal Christians in Texas, but are they actually living a life that is the kind of life that guarantees them salvation? Just because they call themselves a Christian, that's not going to be enough to establish salvation. You may well find that you're actually more likely to be saved on a Christian worldview if you grew up in Malaysia than if you grew up in Texas, because although you wouldn't be a nominal Christian, you might be more inclined to be doing the will of the Father. And I think if you kind of looked around at the way people behave, get rid of the labels and just look at how are they actually behaving? How are they interacting with their fellow human? Are they good people? Do they love their friends? Do they love their enemies? You might find that globally there isn't actually a geographical distribution problem, because people are kind of equally able to do that regardless of where they are on the planet. And if that is what the basis for salvation is, then the problem kind of goes away. Jesus didn't say, no one comes unto the Father except through knowledge of me. He said, no one comes unto the Father except through me. If Jesus is the radically compassionate figure that Christians portray him to be, one way to make him even more compassionate is to say that he died for the sins even of those who didn't know that he did it for them, but he did it for them anyway. So if I were a Christian, I think I'd take an inclusivist approach, but not a universalist approach, because you could still fail to do the will of the Father. you can still fail to be a good person and still end up not being able to inherit eternal life. But it's got nothing to do with being a nominal Christian.
Yeah, that's actually, I think we're probably on board, or I'm on board with that, because to me it seems at least possible that someone could continually like choose to want to remain distant from God, like eternally. That at least seems plausible. Like some people just really, really don't like God.
It makes so much more sense as well if you take an annihilationist view. I think a lot of the ideas of hell being a real place, the philosopher Gvanvig has, I think, 5 theses of traditional hell. There's the fact that it's a real place that actually exists, the fact that that there are actually people in it, that is, hell isn't empty. I think it's 4 actually. The third was that everyone who's there deserves to be there. And the 4th is the inescapability thesis, that once you're there, you can't escape. This is like the idea of traditional hell. But I think the idea of hell being a real place of fire and brimstone, the imagery in the Bible isn't clear on this. I think that a lot of the time, there's a common problem of failing to, or mistaking allegory for literal prediction or truth. And I think there's a good case to be made that annihilationism is the best way to interpret those who don't go to heaven. If you take an inclusivist view that says that doing the will of the Father, not being a nominal Christian, is what gives you eternal life, and that if you don't have eternal life, you just die, you just cease to exist, the problem of ethics of geographical distribution and the problem of punishing non-believers goes away. Again, this could be seen as ad hoc, but of course, if God is the grounding of being itself, take like the contingency argument, which says that things don't just have a temporal cause. The reason that they are sustained in existence, the reason that stuff exists now in any particular time slice is because it is being sustained by God. What does it mean to separate yourself from God? What does it mean to separate yourself from the ground of being? It seems to be to separate yourself from being and therefore to not exist. And so I think that there's a good kind of philosophical case to be made for annihilationism. And then the problem goes away. You have, look, here's an offer to you. If you want to inherit eternal life, if you want to do the will of the Father, then you can come and be with the Father. If you don't want that, it would be unethical to force someone to go through that. That's the usual Christian line. The response is that, oh, what, but does such a person deserve hell? I think certainly not, unless hell is just to not exist. If somebody says, look, I just don't want it, I just want to die, he'll let them die. Now, of course, I'm an atheist. I don't think any of this is true.
Yeah.
But if I were a Christian,
we're looking at different possible responses.
This is how I would make sense of the claim. If you don't do something like that, if you do believe in the traditional Gvanvigian idea of hell, I think there is a huge problem here. Equally, I think that if you think you need to actually be a Christian, but accept Jesus's resurrection in some kind of proactive sense, then there is a problem. Of course, you can say, well, Jesus can still save those who haven't heard the gospel because they're saved on the light that they reject. But of course, there are people like me. I consider myself to be a non-resistant non-believer. It's not that I'm not a Christian because I haven't heard the gospel. It's because I have heard the gospel, but find it, let's say, factually unconvincing, if not morally unconvincing, and factually unconvincing. And so even if you have this disposal problem sorted for those who never heard of Christ, you've still got a disposal problem for people like me, non-resistant non-believers who have heard the gospel. If you think that I'm going to be going to a real place called hell to be punished for my kind of passive non-belief just because I happen to be unconvinced, then I don't know what I could be doing differently. I don't know what I could be doing wrong to deserve that. I tried to engage in the arguments. I got a degree in theology. I lived with Christian housemates. I read as much as I can and widely as I can, and I'm just unconvinced. To say that I deserve to go to hell because of this, because somehow I don't want this, this imagery of God saying, well, look, if you don't want to come to heaven, you don't have to, man. The gates of hell are locked from the inside. That works for somebody who's a resistant non-believer who says, I don't want it to be true. I don't want to worship God. But I'm somebody I'm like, no, I do want this. I would love to inherit eternal life. I'd love to be the recipient of endless love and see my dead relatives again and to worship what deserves to be worshipped. But I just don't think it's true. That's not somebody for whom God can just say, well, look, man, if you don't want it, you don't have to have it. I do want it. But I'm told that is not a sufficient condition for actually receiving it. You have to want it, but also somehow be convinced that it's there and that you can actually grab it. That's a harder problem to deal with.
Yeah, I'd have to think more about that. whether or not that's a requirement, whether you've got to believe it. Because I know that there's a guy, his name is Michael Rhoda, and he's got an updated like version of Pascal's wager. And he basically wants to lower the bar for natural theology. So instead of getting you to like 70 to 80% in order to become a Christian, he's like, as long as he can get you to around the 50% mark, then he says at that point, you don't necessarily have to believe, but you can start to do things like a Christian would, like go to church, and you can do other things, and you can pray, and you can read the Bible, and you can go to fellowship and Bible study. And there's other things that you can do. You don't necessarily have to have belief. But then the question is, yeah, could a person be saved apart from that conscious knowledge? And I think that's definitely possible on my view of Christianity. But maybe we should move on to the next one.
Yeah.
How about we do that?
Sure.
So number 4 is extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. What are your thoughts on that? Carl or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. What do they call it? The Sagan maxim, or the Sagan something. Sagan standard, I think is what they call it.
Okay.
Of course, I've adopted and mutilated this particular maxim for my own purposes in the vegan discussion to say that extraordinary harm and mistreatment requires extraordinary justification. And again, it's relying on the same intuitive kind of understanding of what's being driven at. Mm-hmm. I know Jonathan McGlatchy, that must be the third time I've mentioned him now, but he's a good person to talk to. He rejects this claim. He thinks he's not true. He thinks that any claim requires sufficient evidence. Extraordinary claims require sufficient evidence. Mm-hmm. But again, we can kind of get caught up in the pedantry here, but I think we know what's being driven at, which is that if you want to prove that Julius Caesar existed, then some kind of contemporary accounts which record his existence would be sufficient evidence for that kind of fairly ordinary claim that a man existed. Whereas if you're trying to establish an extraordinary claim, such as the claim that a man rose from the dead, then let's say the same level of evidence, that is some kind of written, fairly contemporary accounts that say, yeah, this man seems to have risen from the dead, isn't going to be enough. You're going to need more than that. This is the criticism that's often given of the historical case for the resurrection of Jesus, is that, yeah, something weird happened on Easter morning. Because, like, even if this is false, even if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, maybe a bunch of people made it up. That's still really weird. Maybe Jesus' death was somehow faked. That's still really weird. Maybe the disciples were mistaken and hallucinating, or the reports were all written down wrong. Mm-hmm. That's still really weird. And so the Christian often relies on the assumption that, well, because something like Jesus not really dying on the cross is such a ridiculous claim. I mean, the Romans knew how to kill people. The only explanation we have left over is that a man rose from the dead. But they forget that from a point of agnosticism or atheism, yeah, they're right. Like, it seems highly implausible that Jesus didn't die by crucifixion, given the historical evidence we have. But you know what seemed more implausible still is that a man rose from the dead. And so then somebody might say, but what evidence are you expecting? Because, like, if you look at any other historical claim, you know, we've got way more evidence for the existence and ministry and death and post-resurrection appearances of Jesus than we do for any kind of comparable historical document. To which I agree. I say, yes, it's impressive, the amount of historical data that we have on Jesus' ministry, but as the extraordinariness of the claim increases, the amount of evidence that we need seems to increase too. Now, I don't know if we necessarily need extraordinary evidence per se, maybe an extraordinary level of evidence. Maybe if there's one very extraordinary claim with lots of very ordinary evidence, that might be sufficient. So it might be wrong in that sense. I'm not sure what extraordinary evidence really looks like. Maybe like extraordinary evidence would be a manuscript that we find that's dated to 1 year within Jesus' crucifixion, where somebody writes their name, who they are, gives you a biography, tells you exactly what happened, tells you exactly how to interpret the text. That would be an extraordinary piece of evidence. But I think we're unlikely to find that. So it would be an unfair standard. Instead, I'd rather say that extraordinary claims require a lot of evidence.
Yeah, so I think that the way that we interpret this is going to determine whether or not it's actually like a true claim. And the best way that I think, the most charitable way of interpreting this maxim in a way that is actually, it makes it true, is like any event with a low prior probability requires a lot of evidence in order to overcome that initial improbability. And I think that, I mean, if you just know your Bayes, then you're going to have to agree with that. And I think that Jonathan McLatchie would have to agree with it as well.
Depending on the way. I think he does.
Right.
So he just doesn't like the way it's phrased.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't know.
Because the phrase is maybe open to interpretation.
Yeah, I should be careful because it's been a long time since I've seen what Jonathan said on this particular claim. I may be sort of misrepresenting him here, but I'm just trying to give an example to listeners, to watchers, that if they want an example of somebody who argues against this claim, because we both seem to agree with it, Jonathan McLatchie has a good piece on it.
Yes, and another thing that I actually really like about this claim is that it puts the emphasis on the prior probability, because like one of the things you just did is you walked through some of the naturalistic explanations of the resurrection, and you're like, yeah, that's still really weird. Like it'd be really weird if everyone just hallucinated, if there was like these group hallucinations, for example. So it puts the emphasis on like what is actually like the initial probability of the hypothesis in question. And I think that's good because there's not enough emphasis on that as it is. Like we need to really be thinking about how likely the resurrection is apart from the evidence. So we have to factor in things like how likely is it that God exists? Because if God is very unlikely to exist, that's going to affect the prior probability of a resurrection hypothesis. So if we have really good evidence that God exists, then that's going to increase the prior probability it's going to increase it a little bit. It's got to increase it somewhat because one of the components of the resurrection hypothesis requires God. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's just like one of the things that I actually like about this is that it puts an emphasis on looking at how likely the hypothesis is in question apart from the evidence. And that's really important. In order to get a high, what's called a posterior probability of like what the actual probability is of the resurrection hypothesis, like the posterior, the end probability, like in order to get an end probability, we've got to calculate the prior probability, how likely the data is apart from the evidence, and then how likely the data actually makes how likely the data makes the hypothesis. And we've got to factor those two together, and then we can get our posterior. That's sort of how Bayes kind of works.
Yeah, and you have to factor in this background knowledge. I mean, I'd be more inclined to accept something like the claim that if God exists, then Christianity is true. An example I've sometimes given is that if you take the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection, what's the best explanation? Well, here's one explanation. Aliens abducted Jesus' body. That seems ridiculous. But
it does explain the data.
Suppose I were to separately establish that there do exist this intelligent extraterrestrial life form that was kind of hovering around
first century Palestine.
Exactly. And I kind of separately established that they were there and that they had a tendency to abduct people who were like significant moral teachers or something like this. Even if say I established that completely separate from, I'd never even heard of the resurrection claims before. I just thought that this was the case. And then I discovered this wealth of evidence that there was this man who was a significant moral teacher who seemed to die and then his body disappeared from a tomb. Well, maybe the best explanation of that is now that aliens abducted him because you separately established it. Of course, you see what I mean by saying this, which is that if you separately establish the existence of a God, especially one that...
And a God that would want to raise someone or become incarnate.
Yes, exactly.
And that's kind of Richard Swinburne's point in his book.
Yes.
Resurrection of God Incarnate.
And especially if you factor in this God being, the God of Judaism, and then you consider that the man who was risen is somebody who at least seemed to claim to be some form of fulfillment of Jewish scripture, this stuff starts to make a lot more sense. And then it might be that if this God exists, then the best explanation of Easter morning is that God rose him from the dead. So you could say something like, if God exists, then Christianity is true, because if I accept God's existence, then maybe the resurrection narratives become convincing enough to convince me that Christianity is true. But
so basically, all I need to do
the other way around.
So basically, all I need to do is convince you that God exists.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'm not sure if that's the case. It's hard to know what a person would be convinced of, but of course, certain beliefs that you have will influence the way that you interpret other data. Even having a religious experience is the kind of thing that can change the way that you interact with arguments. It changes their level of convincingness. You don't get to decide how convincing an argument is. But I would imagine if you took 100 Christians off the street and told them about the Kalam or the fine-tuning argument and they'd never heard it before, and did the same thing for 100 atheists, you'd find a disproportionate number of people thinking that sounds reasonable, and thinking that it doesn't, purely based on their experience of the world so far. It will affect the way that they interpret the premises. And so who knows? Maybe.
So let's move on to the next one. And the next one is actually kind of related to the previous one. So 4 was extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And this next one is just a little bit more simple. Claims are not evidence. What is your take on this sort of infamous quote by Matt Dillahunty?
Yeah, I know you've made quite a song and dance about this. Claims are not evidence. I don't really know what's meant by it. You know, I try to engage in this dialogue. I try to watch the back and forths about it. And again, I'm trying to be careful to make sense of what's being driven at here. To say claims are not evidence. Now, this seems to, if I'm not mistaken, have first come up in the context of the resurrection. And
yes,
the idea is, well, we have evidence of the resurrection because the disciples saw Jesus after they died. And then Matt says something like, well, claims are not evidence.
These are the claims, and
claims.
We don't have evidence.
So what's maybe being driven at here? Maybe the idea that the claim itself is not evidence. Now, I would agree with this. I would say that well, maybe
it depends on the claim.
It depends on the claim, and it depends on the context.
Because if my daughter, I'll just give you an example. If my daughter was like, "Hey, someone hit me at school today,"
that's evidence.
That's a claim, but it's also evidence that someone hit her at school today.
Even if it's not enough evidence to make you think it actually happened.
Oh, it would. It would make me like I would believe her immediately.
But even if it didn't, right?
Right.
It would still be evidence. It might just be not sufficient evidence.
Like the distinction we made earlier between some evidence and sufficient evidence.
But then I think there's maybe a subtle thing to pull apart here is that, like, is the evidence the claim or the fact that the claim is being made? Mm-hmm. Now, I'm more inclined to take the second course, and I think maybe this is where the confusion lies, because Matt will say something like, the claim itself is not evidence. But I think the Christian in this context is saying something a bit more like, the fact that this claim is being made is what the evidence is. The fact that there were these men who followed Jesus, gave up everything to follow him, and then somehow after he died, just decided to claim that they'd seen him risen, and decided to kind of claim that even to their own suffering and persecution. Of course, the fact that they claimed it on its own account would not be very good evidence, but the fact that they were claiming it even as they were being martyred, that does seem to at least... Again, it depends on how you interpret it, but when you start thinking about what best explains this, what best explains the fact that this claim was made? Well, you know, the Christian will say, because they were telling the truth. And then we're basically saying, well, what best explains this piece of evidence? And the piece of evidence is that there were these men who made the claims. It's not really the claim itself that you would call the evidence, but the fact that the claim is being made. And so I can imagine when the Christian hears Matt say, what do you mean claims are not evidence? Like, there are loads of contexts in which claims are evidence, like the fact if your daughter tells you that somebody hit them at school, but it's more the fact that the claim's being made, not the claim itself. I don't even know how you'd isolate the claim itself. But
I think it actually might get back to this whole idea about prior probabilities. So he may just want to... I think the claims are not evidence might actually just be a restatement of like Hume being like, no, you can't have testimonial evidence for a miracle claim. Because the prior probability is so low.
It's possible, but then I don't think that's even what Hume was saying. Hume isn't saying that testimonial evidence is not evidence. He's not saying claims are not evidence.
He's saying that,
like, a priori, it's always going to be less compelling evidence than alternative hypotheses or something like this. I've kind of butchered that there, but you see what I'm saying. He's not saying that these claims are not evidence, just that they're not as good evidence. They're still evidence. But again, is it the claim that's the evidence? I don't. The claim itself, I'm not even sure what the claim is. How do you isolate the claim? Really, what we're talking about is trying to explain why this claim is being made. If I was having a debate with you about whether your daughter was hit at school, we wouldn't be debating the claim so much as we'd be debating, well, how do we explain the fact that she made that claim? What's the best explanation of her making that claim? The evidence is that the claim was made. Maybe that's the same thing as saying, but this is why we shouldn't get too caught up in the pedantics, because if that's what someone's kind of driving at, if what someone's really talking about is the fact that a claim is being made rather than the claim, we should just be able to kind of understand that and realize that what it is that we're driving at.
I think that...
I should clarify that I don't really understand the nature of the claim that Matt's making when he says claims are not evidence. I can't say that he's right or wrong about that. I don't know, but this is how like I would interpret that phrase if I heard it for the first time. But I would need to speak to Matt to know what he really specifically means by that.
Yeah, I think it's actually good we'll leave it there. We'll leave it there and move on to the next one. So number 6 is science is the only reliable guide to truth. What are your thoughts on that?
It's an interesting way you've phrased it there. Science is the only reliable guide
to
truth. Because of course, the idea that the only things that are true are these things that are scientifically verifiable is obviously false. Mm-hmm. Because there are things that just haven't been scientifically verified yet that are still true. The claim that the only things that can be known to be true are those which can be scientifically validated is also false, because there are certain things which we seem to be able to know to be true a priori, which is to say before the facts. That's what a priori means. It means before the facts. That is before observation, before empiricism. If there is such thing as a priori knowledge, then there is such thing as knowledge outside of science. Now, you could be a strict empiricist. You could be like a Humean and say that actually all knowledge is based in empiricism, in which case, actually, yes, the only things that can be known to be true are not quite what those things that can be like empirically verified, but they'll have an empirical basis. That anything that we think is kind of going on just in the mind alone is actually the putting together of observations we have. In that respect, you could say that actually science, if science is taken to mean something like empiricism, because of course science just means, what does it mean, like knowledge or something really vague like this, but I think in the modern day what we mean by science is generally like empiricism, like empirical observation and experiment, this kind of thing. For like a Humean, yeah, like the only sort of way you get to truth, let's say, is through empiricism. I think this runs into some weird conclusions. For instance, David Hume himself recognizes there's a wonderful piece in the treatise where he talks about parallel lines. If you take two parallel lines, they'll never intersect, right? It doesn't matter, you could stretch them out infinitely, they're never going to intersect. Hume thinks that you can't know this because the only way that you can get the idea of a line or parallel lines into your head is because you've like observed things that look a bit like them, but you've never seen perfectly parallel lines. Even on like a train tracks, there'll be like imperfections such that if you were to stretch them into infinity, they may in fact come together. You've never seen perfect straightness. And so Hume thinks that you have no way to know that if you were to stretch it out infinitely, they would never intersect, because all of our knowledge is based in empiricism. We've never observed a perfectly straight line, and so we actually have no kind of empirical basis for this perfect straightness that never intersects, which is weird. That seems like a weird claim. There seems to be things that we can know a priori. Of course, the Cartesian alternative to Humean empiricism, the kind of birth of the rationalist school, which is the competitor of empiricism, begins with the a priori truth that I exist. Now, people criticize Descartes for not being able to do what he claims to be able to do. The best thing that Descartes can do, I think, is establish that which cannot be doubted. It's not quite the same as what's true. You can't doubt your own existence, but does that make it true? Descartes thinks that something like an inability to doubt, clearness and well, I'll try not to get bogged down in the terminology, but what I'm trying to say is that the rationalist school is celebrated for being able to establish a priori truths, but at least the Cartesian approach really establishes what cannot be doubted. So if you think that's a good criterion for truth, then there are such things as a priori truths. Take, for instance, the laws of logic. Why are the laws of logic true? Why is it true that P cannot be true and false at the same time? It just seems to be something that we're incapable of doubting. It's like, what do you mean, why is that true? Like, how could it not be true? The fact that we're unable to entertain its falsity, does that make it true? Maybe, maybe not, I'm not sure. But if you're inclined to accept the laws of logic on the basis that they're you just cannot doubt them, and there seem to be lots of things like this. But this is why I say it's interesting the way that you phrased the question, because of course, like, if a priori truths are kind of a nature that they just cannot be doubted, then you don't really kind of arrive at them in the way that you arrive at empirical knowledge. So when you talked about kind of a guide to truth, you can't really have a guide to a priori knowledge in the same way, except unless you consider the guide to itself to be undeniability. Maybe undeniability is the guide to truth for a priori knowledge. As long as there is some a priori knowledge, in other words, it seems to me false that science is the only reliable way to truth. Of course, if somebody means by saying this something like the only things that can be known to be true are those things which are empirically verifiable, this to me is just trivially false. But again, it kind of depends on the specific claim that they're meaning.
Yeah. See, I think it really depends on how we define science. Like, what do we actually mean? Because some interpretations of science are so loose and so broad that it's just like any kind of reasoning whatsoever. Then at that point, like, reasoning is the ultimate guide to truth, and someone might actually agree with that. It's like,
yes.
Okay, that sounds kind of reasonable. But I think it really depends on what we mean. But if by science we mean this sort of empirical sciences, which is going to actually rule out a lot of science.
It also, of course, depends on exactly what you mean by truth.
Yeah.
Because there are different theories of truth.
I don't want to get into different theories of truth unless you do.
I won't want to get into it. I mean, I'm partial to the deflationary theory of truth.
Oh, really?
Asserting something and then asserting the same thing and saying is true at the end of it just doesn't add anything. It's just a reassertion of it. I think that's quite a useful and interesting approach. But if you read the Meditations, it seems that Descartes is essentially equivocating between truth and undeniability, which is something that needs to be, I think, picked apart. Because, of course, you could just have a theory of truth that says that which can be known to be true is that which is undeniable. But a lot of people don't mean that by truth. They think that truth is something else. Maybe undeniability is the guide to truth. Truth is something else. It's like correspondence with reality. But the guide to get to the truth, to get to correspondence with reality, is that which is undeniable. As a theist, this makes sense because God will have given you intuitions that the kinds of intuitions that are most fundamental, those ones that you cannot deny, God wouldn't be able to make go wrong unless he was a deceiver. This was, again, Descartes' point. A lot of people think that Descartes basically says God must exist through the ontological argument, and because God's not a deceiver, I know that my senses must be accurate and the world exists and this kind of thing. It's not quite as simple as that. Descartes recognizes that even if God exists and even if God designed our senses, we can still go wrong in some circumstances. We could mistake something that we think is small but is actually really far away. This doesn't make God a deceiver. But if God did design our faculties, then there are certain things that he would make us unable to go wrong on. And these would be the a priori ideas. These would be the most basic, clear perceptions that we have, that are clear and distinct, as Descartes puts them. Those are technical terms in his usage. But this would be something like the inability to doubt my own existence. For him, the inability to doubt the existence of God. The conceptual ability to separate the mind from the body. These are things that your mind just is able to do, and it's unable to consider. There's like an inability to not do these things. That's the kind of thing that Descartes thinks if there is a God, he gives you these intuitions. These are the kind of intuitions which will be a guide to truth. So Descartes might think that truth itself is correspondence with reality, but the guide to get to truth is undeniability, because God has implanted intuitions with us. Of course, then you get a Cartesian circle, because Descartes uses this very reasoning to establish the existence of God, but it's the existence of God he uses to vindicate the intuitions that we have. So there is a circle, the famous Cartesian circle, that I don't think is appropriately avoided by Descartes. I think that's where he fails. But there's a lot to be said on this. But I mean, I imagine you probably thought this was quite a straightforward one, depending on what you meant, because I know there are people who say
it's just self-defeating.
If you can't scientifically prove it, then we can't know it's true. It's like, okay, scientifically prove that.
Yeah.
It just obviously doesn't work.
Yeah. So you wanted to save that one for the end. Well, why don't we move on to number 7? So number 7 is atheism is just a lack of belief in God.
Well, this is a point of definition. I really don't...
Because you made a video. Was it just about this question, or was
it was just part of a Q&A?
Okay.
It was a bit of a ruckus. Some people clipped it and put it on Twitter.
Yeah.
I can't remember what the exact question was. I think they were asking about whether I see myself as trying to kind of be at the forefront of like a new atheism movement, or trying to continue the new atheism movement. And I was like, well, kind of depends on what you mean by atheist. And I mentioned that like looking at academic philosophy, you'll find that people don't really use the word atheist to mean a lack of belief in God. And so I said, like, so I don't know if I call myself an atheist in that context. A lot of people got very upset. Some people on Twitter were telling me that, you know, this is they got very, very dramatic about it. I can't remember the exact examples, but they said it was like a dangerous thing to say. They were saying that it's like harmful. And I should have taken more care, I suppose. It was just part of a Q&A. But of course, colloquially, people mean atheist to mean a lack of belief in God all the time. Definitions are descriptive, not prescriptive. All they're supposed to do is tell you, a dictionary's job is to tell you how is it that people use these words. When someone says this word, what do they mean? So if you look in the SEP, which is a guideline to academic philosophy, and look at atheism, it will tell you atheism is the belief that there is no God or are no gods. But if you look in a dictionary, which has a slightly different purpose, this is just supposed to describe how people outside of academic philosophy, just everybody generally defines atheism, you might find that the definition says it's a lack of belief in God. It just depends on the context. So I prefer sort of not to say I'm an atheist, but just to say I don't believe that God exists. Of course, in practice, if I'm hanging out with some friends, if I've met some new people and they're like, hey, you know, do you have like a religion or something? I'll be like, no, I'm an atheist. And that's fine, that'll do. But if I'm talking to a philosopher who wants to have like a discussion or a debate, and they say, so what's your religious views? I'll be like, well, I don't believe in God. I'm not convinced of God's existence or something like that. Because, of course, like it to me, it just is the most uninteresting debate or discussion in the world. For all I care, if we're having a conversation...
See, I think it actually is kind of interesting. And I'll let you finish before I
was just going to say you can define any word however you like. You know, if we were going to have a debate about science and you used the word chair to refer to science, be like, that's weird. But if that's what you mean by chair, then I'll just have to keep that in mind when I'm talking to you when you say the word chair. Like it just doesn't matter to me.
See, I think it can mean in some cases that someone is just a bad communicator. And here's why. So if I were to define unicorn as something that has wheels, like that would be really weird. Like it'd almost be like I'm using the word the wrong way. Like it's in the prescriptive way. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of like, could these atheists who define atheism as a lack of belief, could they be doing it? Could they be using the wrong definition? Is that possible?
At worst, I mean, at worst for my position and at best for your position, I think what you could say is that people at one point did that. That at one point people started kind of inappropriately annexing the usage of the term atheist to describe something that nobody really else meant by it. Maybe to make it slightly easier for themselves in a debate, when somebody says, well, what's your evidence that God doesn't exist? And they started thinking, oh, well, maybe it's just that there isn't any good evidence for God, and so maybe atheism is just a lack of belief in God. Maybe at that point they were being a bit, at worst, irresponsible. It's difficult to say that they were wrong or incorrect, because you can define the terms how you like. But maybe, it was irresponsible. But
or a bad communicator.
Maybe. But then so many people have done this now, and this has become so popular that I don't think it can be called irresponsible or bad communication to do it today. Because if you took a survey...
But if you go back to the unicorn case, it's like if a lot of people started to define a unicorn as something that has wheels, like wouldn't that...
If it got
wouldn't they still be wrong even a whole bunch of people started to do it?
If it got to the point where almost anybody who owned a car called it a unicorn because it had wheels, then I think it would start making sense to just sort of colloquially tell people that, I have a unicorn in the garage, right? This is just how terms evolve. This is what happens in language. And I think if you took a survey of certainly like atheist YouTubers, maybe not like atheists in academic philosophy because of the fact that the definition still seems to be different, but atheist YouTubers, atheists on the street, atheists who are passive, atheists who haven't really thought about it much, like they'll call themselves atheists and they'll mean a lack of belief in God. I think this definition is so commonly used now that it's not irresponsible. I think the only time it can be irresponsible is if somebody's trying to pull a bit of a sleight of hand in a debate and trying to imply by calling themselves an atheist that they believe there is no God, but actually doesn't think that. But this is easy enough to clear up. The only context in which this is going to be really important is when you're having a debate or a discussion. And if you do that properly, this will get flagged and sorted out right at the very beginning. Yeah, if I meet some friends, as I say, and they say, what are your religious beliefs? And I say I'm an atheist, and they think that means I believe there is no God, but what I really mean is that I lack a belief in God. But it's just like a social setting, and they're like, oh, cool, like, that'll do. Like, who cares? It's like if I meet someone and they say that they're a Christian, maybe they're like a non-Trinitarian, and you could have a Christian that says, well, that's irresponsible, because to be a Christian, you should really be a Trinitarian. It's like, okay, and in the context of a debate, we need to define our terms carefully. If I'm debating, is Christianity true? I need you to tell me precisely, what is Christianity? What are the sufficient conditions of Christianity? But if I'm out for dinner with you and you say, yeah, I'm a Christian actually, I'll go, cool. And that's it. Like, who cares? It's just, as I say, so uninteresting to me.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to number 8. This one is, actually, let me look it up. I just had it in my mind and I lost it. Number 8 is, I just believe in one less God than you do.
Yeah, I actually haven't given a whole lot of thought to this, but I know that it's kind of clowned upon by a lot of Christian YouTubers because it does seem a little bit weird. I think the reason why this claim people started to make
I want to be charitable. Like, I want to look at like the best interpretation of these different claims.
I think the best interpretation of this claim is to try to give somebody who's never really considered atheism or doesn't get it, just to give them an idea of what it's like to not believe in something. In other words, if I'm talking to a Christian who's maybe they've been like a Christian cult all their life, and saying God doesn't exist is like saying the laws of physics don't exist or something. It's just like unimaginable to them. I might say like, well, think about how you don't believe in this other God. You don't believe Islam is true. You don't believe in the pantheon of Greek gods, right? It's like,
I think that can be helpful.
What's it like to not believe in those gods? And they're kind of like, well, I just, and I'm like, well, that's kind of what it's like for me not to believe in your God. And so you might say, so I just believe in one God less than you do, as a way to like explain. But to try and use it as an argument for the plausibility that there is no God, I think is mistaken. Because of course, firstly, when you talk about there are so many different gods, well, I think if you speak to monotheists, they don't think there are lots of different gods. They think there's one God and there are different interpretations of this God. It's like that there's this debate around the idea, do Jews and Muslims and Christians worship the same God? They don't, in the sense that Christians worship a God who is by nature in 3 parts and Muslims worship a God of Tawhid. But it could be said that actually this is just a disagreement about how to interpret the one true God, because Christians will think there is still one God, they're still monotheists, and Muslims think it's very strange that this is separated out into 3 persons, but you could say it's like the same God. So, you could say, well, you don't believe in the Muslim God or the Jewish God, do you, Cameron? But you believe in the Christian God. Well, I just believe in one less. I don't think that would make sense, because actually you kind of do believe in that God, you just have a different interpretation of what that God is. Of course, there are other gods, like Greek gods and polytheistic gods, but these are different kinds of entities. The Greek gods are not all powerful. The Greek gods are far more human. The Greek gods are not, they're sort of temporally located. They have particular powers.
They can
and this
die.
kind of thing. And so, sure, I believe in one less God, but God is being used very broadly there. If we very specifically said that a Christian makes the claim that there is a God and that God has to be a monotheistic, all-powerful God. Let's say that the Christian says, I believe in a maximally great being, the Plantingian maximally great being. I couldn't say the same thing then. I couldn't be like, yeah, well, you don't believe in the Hindu maximally great being. You could say that about Hinduism probably. You couldn't say you don't believe in like the Greek maximally great beings, because there kind of isn't really a concept of a maximally great being in Greek mythology. And so I couldn't say like, well, you just believe in one less maximally great being than I do. That kind of wouldn't make sense. I think that when we imagine all these different gods that have been all throughout history and through different cultures, it's like maybe we're not actually talking about the same kind of entity, and so it would be kind of unfair to compare them in this way. But even if it were, of course, the arguments for God's existence seek to establish that there exists some kind of God. And so if you find it convincing that there does need to be, like, the existence of contingent things can only be explained by the existence of a God, the beginning of the universe can only be explained by the existence of God, the fine-tuning, all this kind of stuff, then what you establish is that there exists some God, or maybe some gods, we don't really know, but there exists some God. And then somebody could say, well, you don't believe in this God. Oh, that's because I don't think it fits with the argument. We don't believe in this God. Oh, that's because I think this is immoral, and this God, I have an argument to say that if God exists, he'd be maximally moral. And then I'm like, yeah, well, I just believe in one less God than you do. It's like, that's true, but I have these arguments that establish that there must be a God.
Yeah.
And so it kind of doesn't follow from the fact that I reject other gods on the basis of them not fitting with the argument. Because if for instance, I have an argument that establishes a monotheistic God, then I could say, yeah, I don't believe in the Greek gods, and I just believe in, you just believe in one God less than I do. Well, the reason I disbelieve in those gods is because they don't fit with the arguments. But I still have these arguments that say a monotheistic God must exist, and you don't respond to those arguments by saying that, well, because you don't believe in these other gods that don't fit in well with those arguments, doesn't it seem plausible that, you should not believe in this God because you don't believe in all of these ones? It's like, what are you talking about? So it's an argument to try and, again, a bit like, what was the claim we said earlier, where we said that as an attempt to say that, it was the geographical belief thing, like if you were
cultural
born,
contingency.
if you were born elsewhere, put crudely, like if you were born elsewhere, you wouldn't have been a Christian. It's the same kind of thing that, on its own, crudely, this as an argument for therefore God doesn't exist or Christianity is false, it doesn't work. But it is a useful phrase or term to get somebody in the mindset of where the atheist is coming from, what it's like to not believe in a God.
Yeah, and I agree with that. Okay, let's move on to number 9. Number 9 is, and I don't know how often this is actually like put this way by atheists, but it's the way that I've got it here is just evolution disproves God.
Well,
do you think, is that even a slogan? Would you even say that, like, any atheist even, like, is this a caricature?
There have been atheists that say that, but I don't think you would find most. Okay, you might hear it said in the same way that somebody might say, like, the existence of trees proves God, which on its own sounds ridiculous, but maybe they actually mean something very specific by this. Maybe they think that the biological matter in trees has,
or they mean that trees are contingent,
or they mean trees are exactly
yeah.
right. Like that trees prove God's existence because trees are contingent beings, and you have the contingency argument. Like, okay, so technically, yeah, like maybe it might be a good argument to say, look at the trees, God must exist, right? Because what you mean by that is like, look, here's a contingent object.
Yeah.
In the same way, someone might say that evolution causes a lot of problems for Christianity, and in such a way that I think these problems are sufficient to make Christianity more likely false. You could condense that into evolution disproves Christianity, but it depends on what's meant here. So for myself, I'd rather say something like the process of evolution by natural selection specifically is good evidence against the existence of a good God for a few reasons. There are lots of problems. For a start, the fact that suffering is so embedded into the process of natural selection. As I said the other day, survival of the fittest assumes the death and destruction of the unfit. It's built into the very system. The whole way that this pantheon of life came about is through a process that necessitated and involved incredible levels of suffering for unthinkable numbers of years. So there's this problem of evil from natural selection. It's not just the fact that there's evil existing, but that God seems to have chosen a mechanism that has suffering built into it, when at least feasibly he seems to have been able to do it through other means. He could have just popped us into existence. A lot of people think maybe he couldn't have done. There are, of course, responses to these, but so that's one problem. Another problem is the fact that, for example, human beings are supposed to be special. At least this might not be evidence against God, but against something like Christianity or any religion that thinks humans are special. You can resurrect all of the evolutionary tree. If you think about a human over here, all the way over to a fish over here, and there's like this evolutionary tree that connects them. If you resurrect all of the dead intermediaries and you send them all on a line, every life that's ever existed, you stand it all in one long line. You start with a human. You go human, 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 and that goes on for 100 billion humans. And then they're starting to look a bit more kind of ape-like. Right? It's like, okay, so you've got a kind of apish, maybe a bit chimpanzee, somewhere along the lines. And there's no point at which like a chimpanzee is stood next to a human. There's no point at which like, you know, a cow is stood next to a whale or something, or indeed a crocodile next to a duck. That's not how it works. To be a Christian, to say that human beings are special, you need to think that God can just draw this line somewhere, that you have this one creature that gives birth to another creature, which is, for all intents and purposes, identical to that creature. But this one is subject to the moral law and qualifies for eternal life, but its mother doesn't. That seems strange. Now, of course, you can just say that this is what it means to breathe life into Adam and Eve. There was just sort of arbitrarily chosen this point at which they said, okay, you've got this kind of like pre-hominid ape that gives birth to another pre-hominid ape. And God just goes like, okay, you're a human now. And suddenly they're like rational and can abstract or something. You can say that, but it seems strange, right? It seems like this is a problem that needs to be solved. Of course, also, we're still evolving. It's not like evolution is a thing that happened in the past. It's often spoken of in that manner, but it's still occurring. In a few 100,000 years, human beings will probably have evolved quite a significant amount. If you talk about millions of years, then it will have evolved even more. And so if we're made in the image of God, is there like some point at which we cease to be in his image? If we change so much that we're nothing like our human ancestors, are we still made in the image of God? Is there like this kind of time period that exists in like a bubble? Of course, you could just say that God is going to intervene and final judgment is going to come before that occurs. But, you know, we've been waiting quite a long time already. And I think that the writers of the Gospels seem to imply that they thought it was happening fairly soon. Of course, what does soon mean to God? I think it would be a bit unfair if he told humans that it was happening soon, by which he meant something like, 2,000, 3,000 years. But, what's that to God? I think that would be a bit misleading. But of course, you can take these responses. You can say that God just breathed life into a random sort of hominid, apish ancestor. You could just say that God will intervene before we've evolved past being recognizably human. But these seem, again, quite ad hoc. So there's that problem. And that problem is specifically raised by the fact that we share a common ancestor with other animals. The fact that there's so much suffering embedded. I think there might be a few other problems. But these to me do provide evidence against God. They do provide good reason to doubt the existence of God. And so,
wouldn't the second one just be an argument against Christianity?
Oh, yeah, sorry, excuse me. You're right. The second one would not be an argument against a creator or something.
Yeah.
But of course, if you're imagining...
But the first one, the natural selection, suffering.
Again, that would be an argument against a good God. You can imagine an indifferent or malicious God.
Or they could be a good God and just impotent. They could be...
This is true, yeah. So it doesn't quite... And this is why I would certainly hesitate to say evolution disproves God, right? But does evolution by natural selection provide evidence against a good God? Yes. Does it provide evidence against Christianity? I think so. Is it enough on its own to disprove Christianity? Probably not. I don't think so. Is it enough to disprove God? Certainly not. So evolution doesn't disprove God, but at least in some context, it does provide good evidence.
Some evidence.
God. Yeah. Because this is the confusion that happens. A lot of people say, well, look, there seems to be this caricature of the dialogue that an atheist will say, no, we have evolution now. We've got no need for God. And then the Christian comes along and says, what do you mean like evolution has disproved God? There are all these kinds of responses. There are all these reasons. God could have chosen evolution as his method. And so it doesn't disprove God. But we don't have to work in extremes here. It's not does it disprove God or not. It's like, does it provide good evidence against particular claims about particular gods? Well, historically, we have a good indication that it does, given that it was so troubling. It was so troubling, in fact, that if you read the first edition of The Origin of Species, the wonderful, timeless ending, the kind of famous there is grandeur in this view of life, Darwin talks about sort of life being breathed into one or too many forms, which would be the beginning forms where life started. Because, of course, the beginning of life is still a mystery as much today as it was to Darwin. So Darwin says that this life that was breathed into one creature or to many has been and is being evolved. And it's a beautiful piece of prose right at the end of The Origin of Species. But in the second edition, he made an addition, having been breathed by the creator into one form or many's. He added this reference to a creator, and it seems because he just didn't realize when he first went to publish The Origin of Species what a religious backlash it would cause. He was kind of an agnostic. He read the Bible on the HMS Beagle. He kind of seemed to get more atheistic as his life went on. He started out as a Christian, but there's a famous letter he wrote to his friend in which he says he'd never call himself an atheist in the sense of denying God. A more appropriate term is agnostic. The term agnostic was invented by Thomas Huxley, the famous defender of Darwinian natural selection, in the famous debate that happened at the Oxford Natural History Museum. There's a plaque, you can see it. So Darwin adds this by the creator, because it seems that, like, when he first published it, he didn't realize there was going to be this huge religious backlash. And he was like, well, let me add this reference to the creator. If you ask me, I think he did this in capitulation to a religious backlash. So at least historically, we have some idea to think that, at least people seem to think that evolution provides some troubles for at least Christianity, at least in a Christian culture. And the fact that so many Christians, there are some like creationist groups like Answers in Genesis that spend so much of their time specifically trying to combat evolutionary hypotheses. Mm-hmm. They're not an anti-evolution organization. They're a creationist organization, but they see evolution by natural selection to be one of these big problems for coming to belief in Christianity. So clearly it poses some problems, but it doesn't disprove God all on its own. Nothing really does have that kind of evidential force, proving or disproving God, I think.
Okay, let's get now to number 10, and this is actually, I think, probably my favorite one, and that is, who created God? I like this a lot. I mean, I can start on this one if you want.
Yeah, why don't you give me your thoughts first?
Yeah, so I like this one a lot because I think it really gets at the fundamental difference between the Christian or the theist and the non-theist. Because who created God, I think, is usually put in a context of like someone is giving an argument for the existence of God, and it's like, well, who created that God? And so if you need a response to who created the universe, then why don't you need the same for the God? But then the response from the theist is, oh, well, God is this special type of thing that doesn't need an explanation. And then the naturalist is going to co-opt that response and say, oh, well, then why don't we just say the same is true of the universe? The universe is the thing that doesn't need explanation. So we have these two competing views. God is the thing that doesn't need an explanation. And on the other side, it's the universe or, everything that isn't God that doesn't need an explanation. And that's really the fundamental difference between the two views. It's like, where do you draw the line? Like, where does the explanation stop? Does it stop at God? Does it stop at the universe? What's the best place to stop your explanatory line?
Yeah, that's very useful, because again, it depends on the context in which this is being said, right? So somebody might be using it as an argumentative tool. Somebody might say that we require the existence of a necessary thing. And then somebody might kind of casually ask, well, what explains that thing? It's like, what are you talking about? It's a necessary thing. You're not understanding the argument, but what they're actually trying to get at is they say, okay, but then what about the universe being necessary? Would that require an explanation? As if to kind of trip them up, to say, well, if you're going to say that as long as you posit a necessary thing, you don't need further explanation, what if I posit that the universe is necessary? Now, of course, there'll be responses to this, that the universe is not infinite, it's past finite, this kind of thing. But it could be used as a kind of argumentative tool in that respect. It's also going to depend on the argument that's being used. Because if we talk about, for example, if you take a kind of classical argument for the existence of God, like an argument from motion or something like this, or even a contingency argument or anything involving a regress, the establishment of a first, unactualized actualizer, unmoved mover, uncaused cause is reached by the assumption that you cannot have an infinite regress of causation. So there must be something at the start. And if you ask, well, what caused that thing at the start? You're kind of misunderstanding what the argument is saying. You might just be disagreeing with it by asking that. You might say, well, that seems to still require a cause, and then you're positing like an infinite regress of causation. But if the argument is taking this form of like, infinite regresses cannot occur, therefore wherever you have a regress, there must be a first member. And then somebody asks, well, what comes before that first member? It's like, you're either just disagreeing with that premise, which is fine, or you've kind of not understood what we're doing here. It's similarly, if somebody's talking about explanations, they say that everything requires an explanation, and they posit contingent things, and they say it must ultimately be explained by a necessary thing, and you say, well, what explains that necessary thing? It's like, I think you've just kind of misunderstood what's being posited here. If you want to disagree with it, and you want to say something like, well, something that explains its own existence can't exist, or something that doesn't have an explanation, like a necessary being, can't exist. That's fine, but to kind of accept that there is this necessary being at the beginning of the explanatory chain, and then to ask, what explains it? Well, have you understood what's meant by necessary being here? It's either meant by something that, by necessary being, people tend to either mean something that explains itself, or something that just has no explanation. Like, maybe you've just misunderstood what's being posited here. Maybe you haven't misunderstood, and you're just driving at this intuition that such a thing doesn't make sense, but all you're then doing is just denying that there is this first cause that you can ask of, like, what caused it. So I think it's a little bit of a confused objection. Yeah, I mean, I don't like it as a response. Of course, it can kind of lead to interesting discussions about what can be necessary, what kinds of things require explanations.
Where's the ultimate stopping point?
Where's the ultimate stopping point? But if the argument is just that there must be a stopping point, if somebody accepts that argument and then says, well, what comes before that stopping point? Then they've misunderstood something. They haven't accepted that. They
maybe the question they should be asking instead is, why think that first thing is God or has divine attributes?
That's true. Yeah.
Maybe that's the question they should be asking instead.
Of course, I think somebody who asks it, again, depending on the context, right? But if you present somebody this kind of causal chain or something, and maybe they haven't heard the argument before or something, and the first kind of thought they have is like, okay, so we've got this explanatory chain that must terminate in like a necessary being. It's like, but what would explain that thing? I think, sure, you could technically say, you're being silly. What explains a necessary being? Well, it contains the existence as part of its own essence or something, so stop being silly. But again, let's be charitable here. What are they driving at? Maybe what they actually kind of mean, maybe that translates as something like, that can't be right. That seems like special pleading. It seems like you've got this infinite chain. It seems weird to just say that there's one point at which it just stops. I don't think that makes sense. I think that any point you choose, that would require an explanation, and so it would just keep going. And so when they say something like, what caused God, maybe the thought they're driving at is something more like, I don't believe that there is a terminal cause at the back end of this regress. I think it goes on forever. Maybe that's like the thought that they're driving at. And they might kind of express it slightly unclearly by saying, what caused God? But maybe that's what they're driving at. And if that's what they're really driving at, that's what we should be engaging with. But if somebody actually says, no, I see what you're saying. Yes, we have this infinite regress of causes, and it must terminate in something. I agree. I understand. I'm with you. Now, what caused that thing? It's like you just haven't understood. You just don't know what the argument is saying.
Yeah. Okay.
It all depends on the context, right? With all of these claims, it's not the claim
and the
itself,
way that it's interpreted.
It's the way it's being put forward. Like with the Kalam thing. If you were to tell me, Cameron, that you think that the Kalam establishes the existence of God or the existence of the Christian God, I'd probably be like, okay, like let me hear you out. This sounds like an interesting argument. I want to hear what you're talking about. I wouldn't immediately just say, oh man, you're being so silly. Like the Kalam doesn't get you to God, because I know that you know enough to sort of realize that, and so you must have some interpretation of the Kalam that makes you think that it establishes God. Now that might still be wrong, but I wouldn't just say out of hand that this is a problem because the Kalam just doesn't establish God's existence. Maybe you have a good argument as to why it does. But if I was talking to somebody who'd never done any apologetics or philosophy, never considered any arguments before, had just heard the Kalam, came to me and said, I've heard about this argument called the Kalam cosmological argument, and it proves that God exists, I'd probably say to them that they have in fact jumped the gun. So it's difficult to offer an evaluation of a claim in isolation. The evaluation needs to be made based on who's making the claim, why they're making the claim, and crucially, not the claim per se, but what the thought that the claim is representing. What is somebody actually thinking? What is someone actually trying to express by saying these words? Most people in most conversations are imprecise. We're all imprecise. We use euphemisms. We say things that we don't quite mean. We're kind of trying to draw a picture for somebody of how we think. We can't quite put it into words. And so if we start taking this approach that if somebody says something like, the Kalam proves God, we go, that's kind of on my list of things that isn't true. No, that's wrong. And you get into an argument. Rather think, I wonder why they think that. I wonder, who are they? What reason might they have for thinking that? And that's what you should be judging. Not the claim, but the thought that the claim is seeking to express or that it represents.
Well, it's been a lot of fun, and thank you guys for watching. But actually, instead of ending the video, what we're going to do is Alex has his own Christian claim that he wants to discuss with me, Christian slogan, and it's actually from me, something that I talk about a lot. I'll let him explain it, and then we'll have a little back and forth, and then we'll end the video.
Well, because you told me that you wanted to throw these atheist slogans at me and see what I think of them, and you're right, it's been quite fun. I don't know if I've surprised you with which ones I agree with and which ones I don't agree with. But I hope I've explained everything well. But I know that you're a big fan of slogans. By the way, Christianity is true. And again, it's quite funny actually, because if somebody said, "What do you think of the claim, by the way, Christianity is true?" You'd be like, "Well, that's not an argument. That doesn't work, right?" Mm-hmm. If somebody were to kind of take that claim and be like, "This is such a terrible argument because it doesn't contain any argument. It doesn't lean towards a conclusion. It's just a claim, and claims aren't evidence."
Careful.
It would just misunderstand the reason why you have that claim. That's supposed to just condense something into a slogan. It's supposed to represent something much broader, right? And so one slogan that you use, and you were kind enough to print it on a t-shirt for me, which I can't promise you I'm ever going to wear except when I'm sleeping. But it's the claim, questions are not arguments. Now, you kind of came up with this. Did you come up with this slogan? Am I misremembering in the context of hem and meta?
I don't remember when it first came up.
Because I have a feeling, it might not have been you, but I saw a video of hem and meta making a video that was something like,
20 arguments
yeah. or 20 questions for Christians. I can't remember how he framed it. But the idea was he was asking these questions, and I've done a video a bit like this, and it's a bit cringy. It was a long time ago. But you're asking questions like, why would God do this? Or like, if Noah's Ark happened, then why did no one else notice the global flood? And the response comes, well, look, questions aren't arguments. These aren't arguments against the existence of God. These are just questions which have answers. But the reason why I think I'd want to press you on that is based on what I've just said about the fact that the claim that's being made is often actually just supposed to represent a thought. And I think the same thing happens with the question. Sure, if somebody asks a question, if somebody says, well, if there is a good God, why would he bring us about through a system of natural selection that requires suffering? That's a question. Is it an argument? Not technically, as in it doesn't take argumentative form. It's not a syllogism. But clearly the question I'm asking there is a euphemism for the argument against God from suffering in natural selection. So if I ask you the question, if there's a good God, then why would he allow this? Your two options are to say, well, that's a question, that's not an argument. Or it's to realize that obviously I'm trying to get at an argument by asking that question and putting it into rhetorical form. So sure, the question isn't technically an argument, but it represents an argument, surely. And you can understand this.
That it represents an argument? See, that I just don't know that it always would. I think it depends on the person, it depends on the context. My point of the slogan is simply I want people to think logically. I want people to think about like what actually follows from the things that you're saying. So even when you want to say that you're like developing an argument from this, or that like this question that you're asking could be put into an argument form, I still want to know like, well, what are the steps in that argument? I want to make sure that that argument that you do want to put forward is logically valid. And so that's kind of like the idea behind questions are not arguments, is I want people to think logically. I want the steps to actually logically follow. And it's not like I'm trying to avoid it either. I think that part of it is that questions can kind of trip us up, and they also can make us make logical leaps. So like you might think, oh man, I don't know the answer to this question. Maybe I should think that God doesn't exist. Okay, but that doesn't logically follow. Like especially if you like haven't put it into logical form yet.
Well, it can't logically follow from a question, of course.
Yeah.
But we can't risk turning the rhetoric into this kind of robotic pedantry in the sense that, imagine, for example, we were debating the resurrection of Jesus, and I said, well, the disciples made it up. You might then say, then why were they all put to death for their beliefs? Why were they willing to suffer and die? That's an objection to what I've just said. That although it's framed as a question, that clearly represents an argument of the form, if the disciples made it up, they wouldn't have suffered and died for their beliefs. they did suffer and die for their beliefs, therefore the disciples didn't make it up. But in a conversation,
but that question,
you wouldn't just say that as an argument. You'd represent that line of thought with the question. Because what you do by asking the question is you save time, because by saying, but then why did the disciples die for their beliefs? What this represents is something like the syllogism I just presented. If the disciples are lying, they wouldn't have suffered for their beliefs. The disciples did suffer for their beliefs, therefore the disciples weren't lying. And then you say, you take in some background information. Well, I know that you're an atheist, so you don't believe the conclusion of that. So then I have a question. If you believe that the disciples were lying, but we've got the syllogism that says that the disciples weren't lying, then how do you explain this? Like, there's an inconsistency here. Now, you could take the time every single time you want to have, but if in order to have a discussion, if you had to do that every time where you go to ask a question, you actually try to syllogize it and make sure it logically follows, it would take forever, it would bore everyone into oblivion, and would actually be pointless, because I know what you mean when you say, but then why did the disciples suffer and die? And I would consider it an argument, at least representative of an argument.
So I think two things. So I think arguments can be coupled with, or questions can be coupled with arguments. And I don't think that all questions are bad. And I think that questions, like in this context, can be very helpful. They can help lessen tension and everything. It's like there's a lot of good reasons to use questions. And again, I think that they can be coupled with arguments, but they aren't always necessarily coupled with arguments. And so sometimes, in some cases, and I think in a lot of cases, a question can bypass reasoning. And so that's why, and again, I think that questions are really good. It's not that I'm not saying never use questions. That's not the claim. The claim is simply questions by themselves are not arguments. So you may have a question that you can back up with an argument, and that in that case, I think that's good, and you should be asking questions. And if you're asked, then you can explain and say that, look, here's the structure of why I'm asking this question, if it came to that. So I don't know. I don't see the big deal.
Look at what's happening here. This is the problem with sloganization, is that the very thing that we're debating here is kind of whether questions are arguments. And I'm saying, well, questions can be representative of something a bit more specific and deeper. And in order to object to this or just discuss,
I don't even think they're representative. I think that they can be accompanied by. They're not a question doesn't represent an argument.
I think in the context I just provided, it does represent an argument. I think that's the reason. If you look at
it's not identical, so how can it represent it?
All speech is a tool for people to convey a thought that's in their head into another person's head. And so in my head is the argument that the disciples would not die for their beliefs if they were making it up. And I convey that thought in that context by saying, but if that's the case, then why would the disciples have died for their beliefs? But the thought that's being conveyed by that speech is an argument, and so it represents that argument. But
not necessarily. You're only representing, in that case, you'd only be representing a conditional statement. It wouldn't be like a full argument.
Well, when you take into consider the background knowledge, it would express the syllogism, because we've already established that the disciples, you might have established that it's a fact that the disciples died for their beliefs. It's clearly, all language is just representative. All language does this, and questions are no different. Now, the strange irony is that in order to argue about this, in order to try and defend your position, you just went on this long explanation of, well, when I say questions are not arguments, what I really mean is questions are not necessarily arguments, or questions aren't always arguments, or questions are sometimes, accompanied by arguments. In other words, the very fact that you need to qualify the slogan that you've just given shows that sometimes we take what are actually slightly more complex thoughts or ideas or arguments and condense them for ease's sake into a slogan. And you seem to implicitly recognize that when you say that questions are not arguments, need some explanation. You just spend ages trying to deconstruct it. What is it I'm really trying to express with that slogan?
I see what your point is.
I'm just saying the same thing is being done when someone asks a question.
Yeah. See, I just don't think that that's necessarily the case. It might be the case in a lot of, a conversation between you and me. There might be someone who, like a Jonathan McClatchy, who has a specific argument in mind. But I think in everyday parlance, everyday language, everyday conversations, a lot of times they aren't being accompanied by these sort of strict logical rules, and everything is not you can't put everything into a tight, logically valid package. And so that's again kind of the point there, is that I think in a lot of cases, and again, this, like, I'm not saying that this statement, this slogan is like always true in every case. Like there may be cases where you can find a counterexample.
Yeah,
okay, that's why I call it a truism.
Yes, this is also why I'm probably going to refrain from wearing the T-shirt in public, because but it's. I just think that I think that it can be helpful to people to remember that questions are not, like, you don't necessarily have an argument right here. But so there are two problems that I would see with that. The first is that if somebody, by asking a question, is seeking to represent an argument, then the question essentially is the argument, because that's what's being represented. If somebody is asking a question, but
no, it wouldn't be identical, because you just said it was represented. Are you saying that the question is the argument? Because you already agreed earlier that questions are not arguments, so they can't be identical. You're saying that it's a representative.
But the argument itself is not the thing that's kind of in the brain. The thing that's in the brain is the thought, and the thought is put into argumentative form. I'm saying that one thought can be put into either argumentative, like syllogistic form, or into question form, but it conveys the same thought. The thought is identical, is what I mean to say. But sometimes somebody will ask a question. Confusing. Somebody will ask a question, and they won't seek for it to be an argument. Like when somebody says, where's the nearest dentist? They're not making an argument. That question is not an argument. So yeah, it's trivially true that questions are not always arguments, but the person isn't intending it to come across that way, so it's kind of not a problem. The only time when it would be a problem is if somebody asks a question as if it were an argument, and the other person says, well, that's not an argument. Questions are not arguments. But if somebody is asking a question as a means to represent an argument, or as a means to more quickly get across to somebody the argument that they're trying to make, then...
See, in that case, I think it's fine.
The question is not the argument, but the question and the argument are representing the same thought. So in that sense, they're identical in their representation. They're identical in what it is that they're actually trying to convey.
I just wouldn't say that they're representing the same thing. I would say that they're both like they're both serving the same purpose. They're both trying to get at the same thing, which is trying to get at the argument. Yep. And the question can help with the argument, but the question is not itself the argument.
Yeah, in the same way that the argument is not the thought, but these are quite weird separations that we're making. I should say the second problem I was going to say that I saw with your analysis there is that when you say something like, well, sure, sometimes questions might kind of represent the same thing as an argument or whatever, you kind of granted it to me, but you said, but they don't always do this.
I would say probably in most conversations,
most cases, but that's like me saying, like, if I had a slogan that, trees are not red or something, and you were like, well, like, some trees are red, and I'm like, oh yeah, but what I really mean is, like, trees are not necessarily red, or that most trees aren't red. There are some trees that are red, but, I'm just going to say trees aren't red. That would be a misleading statement, because it seems to imply that there's no situation in which you'd find a tree being red. If you say questions are not arguments, it seems that the thing you're trying to imply, especially given that you're not just saying it in a context, but you're taking it out of context as a slogan that can be put on a T-shirt, it seems to imply questions are never arguments. And it's like, okay, technically they're not the same thing. A question is not an argumentative form. But what is an argument? It's an attempt to establish a conclusion in the mind of somebody else. That's what arguments are for. What is the purpose of a question in a particular context, like the resurrection discussion? It's an attempt to establish a conclusion in the mind of somebody else. It is the same thing. It's doing the same thing. It's representing the same thought.
See, they can serve the same purpose, but that doesn't make them identical.
They don't just serve the same purpose. They're like, as I say, speech itself is supposed to be representative. It has a referent. When I say the cup, like the speech, the words the cup is not the cup, but it refers to the cup. And the thing that I'm doing with my speech here is I'm taking this cup and I'm kind of putting it into this abstract realm so that I can kind of give it to you. I'm just saying that I can do the same thing with a thought, maybe the cup in my mind, and I say the cup. And the words, the speech, the form that they take is not the important thing. It's not the interesting thing. It's the thought that is being represented there. In the same way, an argument is not the thing itself. The argument is supposed to convey a conclusion or a thought or an idea to another person. If you were on your own, if there were no other human beings in existence, you wouldn't use arguments except kind of to maybe come up with like deductive tautologies or something like this. You wouldn't really need to do it because you don't need to find a way to show the plausibility of some premises leading to a conclusion. It's just kind of already there in your head. You just think it all at once. You don't think in orderly fashion, premise, conclusion. You put it into that form to give it to another person. And if I ask a question that seeks to kind of give you the same thought, then it's kind of like, your objection is a bit like if I said kind of suitcase. I said, I've got a suitcase. And then somebody else said, I have une valise, which is French for suitcase, for a suitcase, right? It's like, those aren't identical. Right? Une valise.
They express the same proposition.
Une valise is not identical. It is not the same thing as a suitcase.
Not the same statement.
But une valise and a suitcase are the same thing. In the same way, the question, the form, the words, a question is not the same thing as an argument. But in their function and what the words refer to, they are actually the same thing, in the same way that une valise is the same thing as a suitcase.
So you're saying in that thing that they both share in common is a thought.
Yeah, and you're just putting that thought into two different languages. Imagine you have like the language of questions.
See, but I don't know what the thought. I don't know what the thought actually is. Like, what is a thought? Is the thought like a statement that's like written out in your head?
Well,
what is the thought?
It's hard to say. But
is it a concept of like a? So I just don't know what you mean by thought here.
Right. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, okay, maybe sometimes I'll grant for ease's sake that thoughts might sometimes take the form of syllogism. I don't think they do. I think if you pay attention to when you come up with an objection.
But if they don't, then they're not an argument. If they don't take the form of an argument, then they're not an argument.
But the thought might be the conclusion, and then you realize that you've got some other facts in the air that you could kind of use to.
See, but an argument doesn't represent a conclusion.
The argument represents the kind of. The argument really, I guess, represents the entailment of the conclusion from the premises or something like that. I just think that you can represent the same thing in a question. So, like, the thought might be something. The thought might be, if the disciples were lying, they wouldn't have died for their beliefs.
So a conditional statement.
Sure, and that can be expressed as a conditional statement. I could say the words, if the disciples were lying, they wouldn't die for their beliefs. I could put it into, like, syllogistic form. I could put it into question form. But I think what's happening in doing these things is basically like taking a word and saying the same word in different languages.
So you're trying to get that conditional statement out of a question. You're trying to get that conditional statement out of an argument.
So like in that context, because again, it depends on what the thought is. But if the thought is just that conditional, then if we say, look, the disciples died for their beliefs. Let's say we've just previously established that, and then I say, well, the disciples were lying, and then you say, well, why would they have been put to their deaths then? Why would they have suffered? What you are expressing there is the same thing as the conditional. You're basically saying the same thing as if you were to say to me in that context, but if the disciples were lying, they wouldn't have been put to death for their beliefs. That's just the same thing as you in that particular context saying, but then why were the disciples put to their beliefs? Put to death for their beliefs. Like, language is all completely context dependent. It's about the thought that's being expressed.
There's still not an identity relation between the two.
In the same way,
they're still not identical. So the question is trying to get information. A conditional statement has content, and the question is trying to get information. There's a lot of distinctions here between the thought, the question, and the argument. All three of these things are distinct, and you're wanting to like tie them together to make a point, and I'm not seeing it.
I've just realized I should have said this way earlier. This is the concept of a rhetorical question. What is a rhetorical question?
Yeah. I see. Yeah. So rhetorical questions, those are like the only cases where I think that they might constitute an argument.
Yeah,
but then I don't think that they are. I still don't think that rhetorical questions are arguments, because it depends on what the argument actually is, and the argument can be invalid, and it could involve steps that are like unspoken. So a rhetorical question could just be like trying to get at one premise of the argument. There could be other steps in the argument that are sort of unstated by that one question. So there's a lot of different reasons why I don't think that rhetorical questions are ultimately, or they even can be arguments. And that kind of does respond to like your second worry here about like, if I said that questions are not arguments is like mostly true, I may have like been a little bit too giving there. I might fall back onto like the way that I actually think about this, which is I don't think that questions are arguments. Just
the reason I brought up the rhetorical question point is because you said just a moment ago that questions are seeking to kind of gain something. You said something to that effect.
They try to get information. Questions try to get information.
But a rhetorical question doesn't. But it's still a question. But the purpose that a rhetorical question is being asked for is rhetoric. It's supposed to kind of make a point. It's not actually asking for something. So
I think it is. I think a rhetorical question still is trying to get something. It's just trying to get something that is sort of assumed to be the case. And sometimes rhetorical questions are like the answer is not the answer that they were thinking that they were going to get. So you're still trying to get information when you ask a rhetorical question.
The other thing that I wanted to say briefly was in reference to the point that you just made about the fact that somebody could kind of ask a question, but it's not the same thing as an argument because like it could be like missing a step. It's not the same thing.
Well, one question about one premise, about a conditional statement that you have thought in your head, doesn't necessarily represent the full argument, and there could be other steps in the argument.
I'm imagining, I had a conversation after the event that we did with somebody who he basically claimed that Paul the apostle was lying in his letters. Like he didn't really believe in the Christianity stuff. And in my head, I thought to myself, well, I'm skeptical of that claim because like Paul was a persecutor of Christians. And if he were just lying, there seems to be no reason why he would become a Christian and start lying about Christianity. Therefore, he wasn't lying. That's kind of like an argument that just popped into my head. But what did I say to him? I didn't say that. What I said to him, he said, I think St. Paul was lying. And I said, but then why would he have gone from persecuting Christians to becoming a Christian? That argument was represented there as a question. And then what he said was he said, oh, money. I think he was being paid. He makes it clear in some areas that he's receiving money for the work that he's doing. And so I think he was being paid. So my question there kind of represented an argument in which one of the premises, which is if Paul were making it up, he wouldn't have gone from persecution to acceptance. The premise in the argument that was being represented by that question was identified and responded to by the other person I was talking to. So notice how like the argument is represented in a question, and because it's very clear given the context of the conversation what argument I'm trying to represent with that question, he was able to identify which premise it is that needs responding to and respond to it by saying money. So when he says, oh, it was the money, that translates to something like, I object to the second premise that Paul wouldn't convert to Christianity from persecution because if he were being paid for it, then he would have reason to convert. And that's the argument that he was putting forward. Now, we could have spelled out these syllogisms and we could have put them, but it just would have been
side
useless
by side.
because we both know exactly the arguments we're seeking to represent by him saying, I think Paul was lying. Oh, but why would he have gone from persecution to acceptance?
See, I just don't know why. I don't know why you use the language of represent, other than like just use the word the language of accompany.
Because all language is representative. That's what language is. It's representing a thought. It's representing a mental state. That's what language does.
But it can't represent it because it's not identical. I mean, I want to say it can't represent it because it's not identical. But that's
what representation is.
But the question is not identical.
The president is not identical to the United States, but he represents the United States.
Right. So it's not. So it's not identical. It's not. It's not a.
But if you imagined like the president of the United States in one area of the world and the vice president in another area of the world, and they're both representing the United States, in like qua that office of representation of the United States, they are like the same thing. They're serving the same role. They're doing the same thing. They're both the United States in representation.
Serving the same role is not the same thing as being identical.
But of course, it's not. And I would agree that the vice president is not identical to the president. But sort of qua representation of the United States, they are identical.
So make the point in relation to what we're talking about now.
So,
because I missed it.
Like a question in like the form of a question, like word, question mark, and like premise, conclusion are not identical. They're not the same thing. But like qua the thought or proposition or indeed argument that they're representing, they are identical. They're doing the same thing. It's just the same as saying a suitcase and saying une valise. They're not identical words, but the words are representing an identical thing.
Yeah, I'd have to think more about that.
I think this has been. I'm really interested to see what people have to say about this particular, because we've spoken in some depth now about this. This particular.
Yeah, no, I'd have to think more about the. I mean, we've gotten so deep on this question that I just like would have to start to spell things out before I could say that I ultimately agree with you. And once we start to talk about, once we start to use like Latin and stuff, it starts to get a little bit confusing in my head of how to fit things around. Words. Yeah, how it represents. Yeah, I mean, I guess ultimately, I just don't think that they are identical, and that's really the point. And again, the point is mostly for people to really think logically. That's like the idea behind this statement, and I think that you would agree with that ultimately.
Because again, I'm not gonna hold you to the preciseness of the exact words that you said. What I'm saying is, what I'm thinking is, what's Cameron driving at when he says that? Yeah. And it seems to me that you're driving at, you just want people to think logically. So yeah, I agree with, I don't agree with the statement, but I agree with what the statement is supposed to represent, and that's the important thing. And that's kind of the point that I'm trying to make throughout this whole discussion, that it's not about the thing that's in the air between us, but the thing that those vibrations in the air, that movement of the tongue is supposed to be representing. That's the important thing. And questions can do that just as well as arguments.
Yeah. Yeah, I still want to say that I disagree with that. I still want to say that. And again, I think I would just have to sit down and really think more about it.
I think it's got a lot to do with the philosophy of language. One thing that we haven't really addressed head on has kind of been numinously present, hovering over our conversation. It
just doesn't make sense to me how a question could represent an argument.
I think this requires a kind of in-depth discussion about the philosophy of language, what language does, what it is, what words are, and whether they're identical to their meaning or whether they're identical to the things that they're supposed to represent.
That's what I wanted to say. So the reason why I'm like wanting to balk against this is because I could grant that questions can represent arguments, but that doesn't make questions arguments, therefore arguments. They would just therefore represent an argument.
I see what you're saying.
In some qualified sense.
Yeah, I just think that's kind of like saying the word un valise is not the same as the words a suitcase. Like, yeah, they're not the same words. They're not identical, but they are the same thing. The suitcase is the same thing as la valise. They're the same thing, but the words are not identical. So when you say,
I think the difference that wouldn't match up, and we're at the edge of my.
I also feel like we're kind of going back and forth a little bit. So maybe we should just have some thinking, and maybe we can revisit this at some point once we both thought about it more. Because equally, I'm only putting these thoughts forward to you as I've just kind of.
We've been going for how long? It's already been about 2 hours.
Yeah.
Anyways,
I've just been thinking about. I've only been thinking about this particular line of thought since about an hour ago when I thought to challenge you on this. So I think the best thing we can do is, wrap up, go home, think about it, see what the people think, see their comments, and then maybe we can revisit it one day if it's something that people are interested in.
Yeah, that would be good. I mean, I still I honestly want to just sit here and talk about this with you for a long time, but I think we've lost the audience a long time ago. So it's probably best to do what you're suggesting here. If you guys have any thoughts on questions are not arguments and anything Alex said, if he completely just refuted me and I should stop saying it, let me know. I'll stop making shirts. But I really appreciate you guys tuning in today. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks for coming over to, thanks for coming to my house.
It's been fun, and I think it's been a good conversation.
Yeah,
and I think this has been one of the more enjoyable conversations that I've had the whole time I've been in Texas.
Oh, so, nice.
Yeah. It's good stuff, and thanks for letting me on your channel. It's great to be here in person for the first time.
Yeah.
It's kind of weird seeing everything in reality, in 3 dimensions.
Yes.
So it's been fun.
All right, and I will see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video very soon. So see you guys soon. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. You just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel, Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?